Once upon a time in America, our military was a well-oiled, well-funded machine capable of projecting massive power anywhere in the world. But this country's strength has never been solely weighed by its guns and treasure. 250 years ago, farmers and shopkeepers, printers and blacksmiths fought a mighty empire, armed with little more than courage and a dream of freedom. I think we all suspected. No, we knew that atrocities like this were happening, but the proof is so horrifying it's almost surreal. This was innocent blood running red on Main Street. Your families and friends shot down like animals. It reveals an enemy that wants to dehumanize us by pushing American corpses into an unmarked ditch can't bury our defiance. If dirt and gravel fill silent mouths, we'll speak for them and tell their stories to the world. The dead have names as long as we fight in their memory. I am the voice of freedom, but you're its terrible, swift sword. This is a war of the people, by the people. Let freedom reign.
Please don't look. Just don't think about it.
Wait!
Close your eyes!
So, do I believe civilians should be training and preparing? The short answer is yes, absolutely. You have the right to do so, and it is the right thing to do. If that's all you needed to hear to be convinced, congratulations. I heavily recommend looking at videos that cover skills from other creators, be it CQB, reconnaissance, marksmanship, bushcraft, water procurement, hunting, vehicle maintenance, and preparedness in general, or even looking at ways to see how you can help in the event of a natural disaster. Now, if you aren't as easily convinced or are just as curious to see what my views are on the topic, stick around, and I hope I can explain my reasoning in a meaningful way. So I want to start with the history of armed civilians. So throughout history, civilians have time and time again risen to the occasion to defend their homes against the enemy, with either the assistance of professional militaries, mercenaries, or they stood alone, with the love of their families and their people being the motivation to win. I want to highlight a few historical examples from around the world before I mention anything in the United States, or modern examples to help broaden the ideas of armed civilians. The first example I want to touch on is the forces of Jan Žižka. Now, Jan Žižka is known for unconventional tactics which now would be considered early examples of asymmetric warfare. Many of Žižka's forces were recruited from nobility, militias, and a lot of peasants of the regions he was operating in. These peasant armies he created were reported to be highly disciplined and extremely loyal. Now, they were typically fighting against better equipped and better trained armies that vastly outnumbered them. Now, Žižka rarely committed his forces to battle unless he had a tactical advantage over his enemy, which usually consisted of a professionally trained and well-equipped opponent that often outnumbered his forces. He did this through extensive reconnaissance of the terrain, ambushes, and disrupting enemy troop movement and supplies, and the use of wagenburgs, or wagon forts, which are sometimes considered the earliest uses of armored vehicles. The next example I want to cover is the assault on Copenhagen in 1659. Now, Dutch and Danish forces defended the walls of Copenhagen against Swedish forces, but from what I read while researching for this video, the defense consisted of roughly 3,000 professional soldiers, 3,500 city militia, and then armed civilians totaling to roughly 10,000 defenders depending upon your sources. Civilians prepared for the assault by clearing the ice and creating obstacles for Swedish forces. During the battle, civilian forces manned the walls, utilizing muskets, farming equipment, and boiling water to fight off attacking forces. At the end of the battle, Danish and Dutch forces were victorious, sustaining a fraction of the casualties they inflicted on Swedish forces. Now, of course, we can't talk about the history of armed civilians without discussing the American Revolution. Now, at the time before the battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonies had no standing army. Instead, they relied on what was known as patriot militias, consisting of part-time soldiers or raising temporary provisional armies. Now, at the battles of Lexington and Concord, American militiamen first engaged British regulars in Lexington, wounding 1 British soldier, while 8 militiamen were killed and 10 were wounded. Minutemen then retreated to Concord, where at Old North Bridge, roughly 400 militiamen engaged a force of 100 British regulars, driving them back to the main body of British troops in Concord. While the British started the return march to Boston, militiamen from neighboring towns began ambushing British forces along the return route. By the time British forces had reached Boston, 15,000 militiamen now surrounded the British forces in Boston, all while receiving 73 soldiers killed, 174 wounded, and 53 soldiers missing. On June 17th, the Battle of Bunker Hill, which resulted in a British victory, came at a staggering loss. British forces suffered 1,054 casualties, including 100 commissioned officers. Meanwhile, colonial forces lost 450 casualties total, 138 of which were killed. These reports led to British General Thomas Gage being relieved just 3 days after his report was received. Meanwhile, George Washington was on his way and believed that the casualty reports were somewhat inaccurate, but it gave him hope that his army may prevail in this conflict. The last battle I talk about in terms of the American Revolution before we move on to modern examples of armed civilians taking action is the Battle of Saratoga. This battle was an American victory that marked the turning point in the war and convinced the French to enter the war as an American ally. The Battle of Saratoga would see colonial forces take 330 casualties total as compared to British forces receiving over 1,000 casualties, and over 6,000 British and German soldiers were taken prisoner, as well as the surrender of British General John Burgoyne to American General Horatio Gates. A British officer stated the following: "The courage and obstinacy with which the Americans fought were the astonishment of everyone, and we now became fully convinced that they are not the contemptible enemy we had hitherto imagined them, incapable of standing a regular engagement, and that they would only fight behind strong and powerful works." Looking at some of the opinions of our founding fathers, George Washington, during the first annual address to both the houses of Congress, stated, "A free people ought to not only be armed, but disciplined." Thomas Jefferson stated, "No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms," as well as, "What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms." Now, we can go on and on quoting our founding fathers' words on why they believe the American populace should be armed, but keep in mind, at that time, civilians were equipped with the same, if not better equipment than most armies. Now, let's look at some modern examples of civilians taking up arms. Of course, we have the most obvious example of Ukraine. The months leading up to the Russian invasion, Ukrainian civilians began training basic small unit tactics and weapon handling skills. This was in reaction to years of Russian forces building up on the Ukrainian border on the Russian and Belarusian sides of the Ukraine border, as well as a precaution after the Russian annexation of Crimea, which was followed by years of skirmishes against Russian-backed proxies in eastern Ukraine. This is opposed to us in the US, where our firearm laws allows us to be proactive and train long in advance. Now, prior to the war, Ukraine had relatively strict firearms laws. You needed a license to own a firearm. You need to be 25 years old to own a rifle, 21 to own a smoothbore weapon, and 18 to own a cold or pneumatic weapon. No criminal record, no history of domestic violence, and you needed a good reason to own a firearm. Handguns were outright banned except for target shooting, the rare instance you had a concealed carry permit, or if your handgun was awarded for service. There's also a 10-round magazine restriction on top of the requirement to renew your license every 3 years. However, just before the invasion began, the Ukrainian government approved a law which gave civilians the right to open carry. The next day, February 24th, 2022, Zelensky stated, "We will give weapons to anyone who wants to defend their country. Be ready to support Ukraine in the squares of our cities." By February 26th, over 25,000 rifles, 10 million rounds of ammo, and an unknown number of RPGs were handed out to civilians, and all you needed was an ID. Moving north, countries such as Estonia and Lithuania, both of which border Russia or a nation closely allied with Russia, both have civilians preparing for a potential conflict with Russia as well. Estonia calls the civilian army Kaitselit, or in English, the Defense League. I am terribly sorry if I butchered that pronunciation. I am not Estonian. These civilians participate in large-scale training operations, not only with the Estonian military, but with NATO forces as well. The Defense League is not only equipped with standard-issued small arms, such as the LMT R20 or the G3, but also have dedicated anti-tank units and machine gun units. Now, Lithuania does something similar to Estonia, but on steroids, in my opinion. They have what they call the Riflemen's Union, which is a volunteer paramilitary organization that works with the Lithuanian army that trains infantry tactics, weapons handling, and defensive operations. In 2025, they also started training citizens as young as 10 in drone warfare. Now, for the Riflemen's Union, they are divided into two groups. The first being young riflemen for ages 11 to 18 years old, and riflemen, which is for anyone who is over the age of 18. They specifically are preparing for armed and unarmed resistance against foreign invasion. These riflemen also participate in large-scale training exercises alongside the Lithuanian military, as well as doing their own training. In my own personal opinion, I believe that since we were afforded the opportunity to own firearms thanks to the Second Amendment, and looking at the ideas of our founding fathers, civilians should be capable of taking up arms to defend our home, be it enemies foreign or domestic. The reason I think civilians should train, as our laws and culture allow us to be proactive as opposed to reactive in terms of preparation. Historically, civilians rose to the occasion multiple times to defend our nation and its people. I previously covered some significant battles of the Revolutionary War, but there were also events such as the Battle of Athens in 1946, where civilians took up arms to overthrow a corrupt government that was manipulating election results. Now, there was no proof I could find to back up if this quote was actually said, but a famous quote attributed to Admiral Yamamoto of Japan is, "You cannot invade mainland America. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." This statement, spoken by Admiral Yamamoto or not, has created the idea that the armed populace of America alone is enough to deter any attempt at a foreign ground invasion of the mainland United States. As spoken by the Barrel and Hatchet YouTube channel during an interview, they are not looking for a fight, but I believe that strongly trained and well-armed populace is the best prevention to war, and I completely agree. Now, of course, there's more to it than just being armed. You need to train tactics and skills, as well as prepare ahead of time. You should understand the concepts of small unit tactics, casualty care, marksmanship, maintenance, and start having supply of food, water, and medical supplies. Visit farmers markets and talk to the farmers and gardeners, and learn how to help not only yourself and your family, but also your community. Now, people who don't train will see you training and ask, why do you feel like you have the need to train? And some of you may or may not have an answer to this question. Looking at the last 30 years or so, you could easily compile a list of reasons that could convince people to start training, or at least explain to them as to why you train. Now, Brass Facts made a pair of videos called SHTF Threat Response Index and SHTF Preparedness Pyramid. I think these covered this topic pretty well, but I'm going to cover the topic anyway and very briefly. So the first reason why you may begin training is natural disasters. Natural disasters are, in my opinion, the most likely event you'll encounter, from hurricanes that bring flooding like we saw with Hurricane Helene, tornadoes destroying whole townships such as the 2011 Joplin tornado, blizzards trapping families and homes and deactivating power grids like what we saw in Texas as well as here in the Midwest, and wildfires that destroy homes and displace families for years. Being prepared for natural disasters like these not only will help you protect yourself and your family, but in the aftermath, you may have the ability to help rescue efforts, as we saw after Hurricane Helene, where civilians assisted in bringing supplies to remote families and communities trapped by the damages of the storm. The next reason can come as a direct effect from the natural disasters, as well as a multitude of other reasons, but that will be rioting and looting. Now, most of us remember the riots of 2020 and the adventure that brought, but I personally wasn't home for it, as I was on a UDP to Okinawa. But I remember seeing pictures of the fires in Minneapolis being visible from the Wisconsin side of the St. Croix River. Shortly after I got out of the Marines, I happened to be in Minneapolis and decided to drive by the burnt out 3rd Precinct building that, to my knowledge, I'm pretty sure to this day is still barricaded up 5 years later. Now, during all of this rioting and looting, many locally owned businesses were getting destroyed, and we saw in some cases shopkeepers either hiring security or taking security into their own hands, as a lot of these rioters didn't care about who or what they were destroying. They just wanted to destroy something. Now, looking back to 1992, we can look at the LA riots and everyone's favorite, rooftop Koreans, who, if you don't know, were members of the Korean communities who were pretty much abandoned by local law enforcement and had to defend themselves. Shop owners took to the roofs, armed with basic small arms at the time, and got into open and televised gunfights with rioters. Radio Korea canceled all of their own programming and instead aired calls for help from business owners, operating as a dispatch for these businesses. Eventually, they were able to force out the rioters after numerous gunfights and secure their neighborhoods. Now, even the short-term but intense rioting and looting can lead to the next problem, which is the shortage of police officers. In the months and years following the 2020 riots, we saw a heavy shortage of police officers. Now, this was due to multiple reasons, but one of the big ones was the op tempo. In 2020, police departments hit huge amounts of overtime spending. In Minneapolis, they spent $5.2 million in overtime spending just from January to February. Chicago spent $177.5 million in overtime spending in 2020 alone. Now, police shortages lead to a number of issues, including longer 911 response times to any call. Crime rates are going to rise as people with malicious intent will understand that they'll have a higher chance of not being caught, and hiring standards begin to drop as departments attempt to hire more and more officers to fill slots. I saw this on the security side as well, working in Minneapolis, where we got hit with mandatory overtime multiple times that burnt out a lot of guards. Moving on, there are also domestic terror groups or just violent groups in general. In recent years, these groups have begun to become more and more organized. Now, these groups usually have been using significant events in order to test theories and implement new strategies and designs. Most of the time, we see them mostly conducting security operations during protests. What most people don't see is the large amount of intel that is being gathered, organized, and then disseminated to their members in the field. We saw this in the Twin Cities this last winter with anti-ICE protesters using basic reporting formats, rolling signal chats to coordinate movement, and even had a license plate database to track vehicles. Pair this with the vulnerabilities of flock cameras that allow for just anyone to access the data, and you have a well-oiled intelligence gathering machine. While these types of groups typically target local, state, and federal law enforcement in either their actions or in their training, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to see them also begin to target individuals or communities that they deem as against their interests. Finally, the most unlikely scenario would be a Red Dawn style foreign invasion. The reason I say this is the most unlikely is that the United States has the advantage of being a pretty inhospitable landscape for invading armies, given the Rockies, Appalachians, and other various terrain and climate considerations. That's just if they can reach the continental United States. You still have to get your invasion force past the US Navy and the Air Force. I could go on and on about how the US is a fortress, but we'll say that in this scenario, enemy forces have landed ground forces in the United States. First and foremost, the best thing you can do is make sure your family is safe and supplied. Food, water, medicine, weapons for security, and so on. Do you need to move away from the front line or not? I would say if you wanted a decent example of how this looks, look at the civilian reactions to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many civilians evacuated contested areas and relocated to safer cities and towns, or fled the country as refugees. Many enlisted or were conscripted. As time goes on, however, you still need to provide for yourself or a family, which means you need a job. In many ways, life just goes on. It just so happens that there's a war in your country. If you are going to take up arms against an invading army, who is handling your logistics, your intel gathering? Do you have any supporting units? There are so many things you need to take into consideration before following a course of action. These were just a small portion of the scenarios someone could plan and prepare for. Of course, there were a few I left out, such as the whole reason as to why we have the Second Amendment. But I feel as if that specific reasoning has been discussed so often, and the fact that you should understand the Second Amendment by the time you graduate high school, that I decided not to hit on it any further. I generally recommend not to focus on just one scenario, but have a general state of preparedness that can flex into different scenarios. This will be the most important part of this entire video, in my opinion. In this section, I want to cover how to actually prepare for some of the scenarios we discussed. First things first, fitness. We've heard it over and over again for years now. If you're not fit, you're gonna die. And it's still true. Physical fitness is absolutely important, not only when it comes to preparedness, but I believe your level of fitness directly reflects your commitment to yourself, your family, and your friends. I'm not saying you need to be built like a 240 gunner in a 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm just saying you shouldn't be fat, and there are standards that you should be able to meet. Personally, my favorite standard to follow to this day is the Marine Corps IST or the PFT. The big difference between the two is that the IST is half the distance for the run. It's just what I'm used to, and of course there are other standards and goals to reach for, but this is just the metric I use to gauge where I'm at. I recommend working on your cardio more than you think, because cardio capabilities will definitely show before your strength does. Go for runs, go for rucks, lift weights, do calisthenics, stretch, take care of your body. Focus on your body's longevity above all. Now we have planning. Now with planning, it's more than just an if-then plan. It needs to be well thought out in advance. Are you bugging out or are you bugging in? Do you have stored food? Do you have multiple sources of clean water? Do you have animals you're farming? Do you have medicine? There are so many different questions you need to ask yourself to help build a plan or even multiple plans that you can flex into. Now, everyone's situation will also be different. Obviously, some people live in the city, some live in small towns, and some live out in the country. I'm not here to tell you what my plan is or what I believe is the right plan, but what you can do just to start is something called an area study. Now, Forward Observer posted a video on what an area study is and how to make one on a YouTube video roughly 6 years ago, and I'll post a link to that video in the description. I heavily recommend you watch that video if you want to create an area study to help in your planning process. Next, we have supplies. Now, an easy way to look up what supplies you need is to look up what the CDC and FEMA recommend in the event of a natural disaster, and then build upon that. Ready.gov/kit, which I'll link in the description as well, has a list of items you should have in the event of a week-long event. Now, in my opinion, that's not a bad starting point, but as we saw during COVID when people were fighting like Mike Tyson over toilet paper, you should absolutely plan on having more than just a single week's worth of supplies plus more. Your supplies may also look a little different depending upon your environment as well. Does your environment allow you to grow food? Can you hunt and forage for food? Do you have access to clean water? Do you have medicine, or can you readily attain medicine, especially if you have a family member who's heavily reliant on it? If you have weapons, which you should, do you have spare parts? Do you have ammo? Do you have any maintenance tools? How much ammo do you actually have? Do you have a radio to even listen to emergency frequencies and communicate with friends and family? There's a lot to consider, so I recommend creating a checklist with your priorities in consideration and then start building into a short-term, mid-term, and a long-term plan. Moving on, let's look at what kind of skills you should be focusing on as a civilian. Everyone talks about how cool it is to drop $1,500 on an awesome rifle course, which is cool, and I'm certain you learned something, but is it as cool as attending a Stop the Bleed course that can be as little as $3.99, but is usually under $200, or a basic lifesaver course for around $100, or as a basic CPR and AED class? I bet half the people who watch this video don't even have their CPR and AED certification. Now, there are civilian-oriented TCCC classes available, which sounds more high speed, but can cost anywhere from a few $100s to a few thousand. Just keep in mind, there are never enough medically trained people in the world. The next skill I look at is marksmanship. Now, you can start this on your own, watching videos, reading books, and so on, but start with the basics of marksmanship. Can you even zero your own rifle? Do you know how to properly hold your rifle and grip your pistol? Start slow. Work on applying those fundamentals of marksmanship. If you want to take it to the next step, start pushing your shooting to points where you begin to fail, where your groupings open up a lot. Uncomfortable shooting positions, target transitions, reloads, and so on. Honestly, a solid start to marksmanship, specifically rifle marksmanship, is following the Marine Corps method. You can buy a little data book, practice shooting positions by snapping in on a target where you can get comfortable in those positions and pull the trigger without too much movement in a rifle. Then practice those positions at the range if you can. If you're limited on distance at your range, like I usually am, I use reduced size targets to simulate distance. It's not as good as actually shooting at distance, but it's something. As for pistol, I generally suck with pistol in my opinion. It took me until after my CQB school pistol qual to realize that if I focus on my front sight, I'll be more accurate. Now, if you still want more, visit your local gun range. Most of them will likely host marksmanship classes that vary in skill set. Once you feel confident in the basics of marksmanship and can be the envy of all your friends who don't shoot or maybe shoot twice a year for deer season, you can move on to more advanced courses or even just push yourself in a competition. See where your failure points are. Talk to other shooters around you and work on those failure points. Something I was always told, that if you can self-identify what you're doing wrong while shooting and can start to correct it, you'll be a great shooter. Next, we can look at land nav. In today's day and age, most people carry around a smartphone and can get from A to B pretty quick without much thought, or own some kind of GPS like a Garmin or any other GPS device. But stuff can break, batteries can die, you can lose connection to cell phone towers or satellites, and the other list of issues that could cause these digital methods of land nav to fail. In the event of those failures, I heavily recommend learning how to land nav using a map, compass, and protractor. Now, I'll go in depth on land nav in a future video, but for now, I heavily recommend looking at some guides online. I know Garantham has made a guide, as well as Dirty Civilian, Stokermatic, Warrior Poet Society, and many other channels. Just pick one and actually take notes of what they're saying and showing. The best places to practice land nav are local state parks or public land, but you can realistically practice it anywhere. It's just different environments may be harder than others. For example, SOI West land nav course is pretty easy given the amount of terrain association you can do, whereas my corporal's course in Rota, Spain sucked because one of the points was in a cactus field. We were searching for NCO swords stabbed in the ground. Now, I'll briefly touch on the final skill set I want to talk about in this video, even though there are plenty more, but that is small unit tactics. Small unit tactics is a pretty broad topic, so again, I won't go in too much detail because I believe small unit tactics deserve its own video or even its own series. But here's a quick and dirty. Small unit tactics usually consist of skills such as basic patrolling, immediate action drills, basic CQB, fire maneuver, or fire movement, and breaking contact, just to name a few. Now keep in mind, most people don't have a squad or platoon worth of people to work with, and at most may only have a fire team sized element. That's why, in my opinion, I believe civilians are going to have to rely more on guerrilla style tactics or look at some of the tactics we see from smaller units out of Ukraine that have fire team sized elements completing squad level tasks, as well as squad sized elements completing platoon level tasks, and so on. Now, looking at tactics as a whole, I believe rather than looking at current military doctrine and simply copying it, we need to start learning from that doctrine and adapt it to our actual situations. As civilians, we don't have the logistics capability to install a fast food trailer in a country within 48 hours or resupply a platoon's worth of ammo within a day or so. Engagements need to be decisive, as we saw with Jan Zizka and the way he conducted warfare. We can't afford the loss of equipment and people, so pre-mission planning and intelligence gathering will likely be absolutely key before any kind of operation. Now, as it comes to weapons and equipment, you don't need some uber Gucci kit and rifle. You can absolutely get it if you can afford it, and yes, some parts and equipment can make some things easier. However, in the big picture, something like a surplus TAPS rig over a slick armor carrier with a surplus Marine Corps pack system and a basic AR will be able to accomplish almost everything you'll ever need. Now, I'm not saying you should cheap out on this stuff. It's equipment that you will be trusting to work when you need it in a life or death situation. I also won't shill for one company or another. I have my preferences in terms of manufacturers, while someone else may prefer something else. What I can say, as someone who has once issued the bare bones basics from SIF, the stuff you see on the surplus market, such as TAPS rigs, Marine Corps sub belts, Philby packs, and Army equivalents, absolutely can work on a budget. This can be repaired relatively easily and can be replaced without the fear of losing hundreds of dollars. What you need to do is start looking at your area study that we discussed earlier and start looking at what the most likely course of action will be and determine what gear you'll likely need first. Then you need to create a budget. I know we want everything right now, but trust me, budget this out, especially if you have a family or other priorities that need to come first. As you begin to upgrade your kit, you can either sell your old stuff or hold on to it as handout equipment or just replacements if some of your equipment begins to fail or break. Now, when it comes to the rifle, I recommend getting an AR chambered in 5.56x45. There's no need for your rifle to be some obscure rifle chambered in some obscure round. The 5.56 AR-15 is the most popular rifle in America. Parts and accessories will be everywhere. Now, you should look at a minimum of having at least a sling on your rifle, a weapon-mounted light, even if it's just duct tape to plastic handguards. When it comes to optics, iron sights are the bare minimum I recommend getting. If you're going to upgrade to an actual optic, I don't recommend doing what I did and buying a $2,000 Elcan. I did it because I liked the Elcan and I knew what I was getting into. In my opinion, Sig Sauer red dots and hollow sun are just fine for some of your first optics. Going from there, maybe you want a prism optic, such as something from Primary Arms or Vortex for some cheap magnification and a decent reticle. Going up from there, you have companies such as EOTech, Aimpoint, Vortex, and some hollow sun models that seem kind of interesting. If you want to go the LPVO route, Vortex, Night Force, Trijicon, Sig, EOTech, Leopold Steiner, and many other companies offer solid LPVOs that can do the job and have the ability to mount a red dot on top for passive aiming under night vision if that's something that you have. Of course, we can't forget the gold standard, the ACOG. Don't get me wrong, she's not for everyone, but the ACOG is one of those optics that you don't really choose, it chooses you. I'll briefly talk about night vision and thermals. Now, I don't own thermals, but I would like to in the near future, but I have used them quite extensively recently. Night vision offers more than just being able to see in the dark. Night vision opens your business hours for an operation to 24 hours a day. Of course, they require ambient light to even work, so the darkest of nights or even indoors may be hard to operate in, but you'll still have an advantage over those who don't own night vision at all. If you're new to night vision, I recommend starting with a PVS-14 or some other kind of monocular, and when you're ready to upgrade, you can either sell the PVS-14 or bridge it with a thermal like what we see with the Falcon Claw ecosystem. Thermals, on the other hand, do not require ambient light, but they can work in both the day and night and are extremely useful for detecting signatures of both enemy or even friendly forces in your area. Both, of course, cost a lot of money. You're looking at a minimum of roughly $2,500 for NVGs and maybe $3,500 for quality thermals. But keep in mind, These are literally superpowers that you can buy. Personally speaking, I own a mix of really nice kit and some more affordable options. I have a high-com, high-cut helmet with dual-com Comtac 6s. I have a Faro FCPC version 5 with LTC plates, but a surplus Marine Corps Philby pack system. And I use a Faro Concepts Bison belt. My rifle is a hodgepodge of parts like the Elcan, my Griffin Optimus 6, my Centurion 14.5 mid-length, a Viltor upper, and an 80% lower with a Geisley trigger and lower parts. But I've also been outclassed by dudes who are super proficient running cheaper setups for both rifle and kit. Now let's move to everyone's favorite and least favorite topic at the same time, community building. I'm gonna break this down into two subcategories. The first one is your local community. This includes your neighbors, maybe your whole neighborhood, and your local community in general. Get to know the people around you. Introduce yourself. I know a lot of us are internet shut-ins that black pill all the time, but if you step out of your comfort zone and just knock on a few doors, introduce yourself, maybe attend a few community events such as charities, festivals, farmers markets, and so on, you'll begin to figure out how and build rapport with those around you. That way, if they happen to see you in your kit when times are tough, they won't call the police or stab you in your sleep over a can of baked beans like your average DayZ player. The next one is going to be your training community. This is going to be the group of guys you're actually training tactics and marksmanship with, as well as building rapport. I met my guys years ago through a networking Instagram that I don't really think exists anymore, and now we've been together for so long, I consider them my Marines away from the Marines. I've also met groups through Facebook pages, or my personal favorite is on Instagram through Reaper Consultation and his quarterly Find Your Tribe post. I've met some awesome dudes through those. Otherwise, go to the gym. I know plenty of guys who have built groups through meeting at the gym. It's almost like people who go to the gym and care about their health and well-being also tend to care for other people's health and well-being. A more on-the-nose idea is to attend shooting matches. I recently attended the Whiskey Hotel 4-man Team Ruck match. I met a lot of awesome people. If you're iffy about someone and want to test the waters, just go for a ruck with them at the range. You don't have to dive into small unit tactics right away. Kind of like how you don't want to hand a woman your house key on a first date. I heavily recommend, if you're one of those guys who feels like they're just alone in their training, reach out through those methods that I just mentioned. Also, make yourself look more professional. Start working out, even if you're not in perfect shape. As long as you're actually working on it, not just saying it, most people will take you more seriously. Also, square away your kit. Again, you don't need to have the most Gucci to your kit, but make sure your equipment is properly fitting and serviceable. Don't look like the day one Marine Corps recruit who's baseball capping your cover. Now, we covered a lot in this video. We covered why I believe civilians should be armed and should be training, along with some historical examples and thoughts, modern examples, some of the situations that would require armed civilians, and how to begin preparing, which a lot of those topics honestly deserve their own videos, so I only hit on them briefly. I hope you all learned something from this video. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, and I thank you for watching.